Right, good evening. If you've just joined us, I'm Nic Pegg. You're back with After Dark. I spoke to Carmia Young last week. She's an architect behind the Colette's Corner co-housing development in Littleton. She's a very keen publisher on Facebook, and I noticed recently she had some very interesting ideas about not working harder, but working less. And she joins me on the line now. Good evening to you.
Good evening. How are you today?
I'm very good, and I'm really interested in the idea of working less. Is this working smarter rather than harder?
I don't think it's quite smarter rather than harder. I think it's actually more looking at trajectories of change and what our planet really needs. I mean, I guess right now the article that I posted, which you commented on, was we're living on a planet with finite resources, and we can't have infinite growth. And so the idea was well, how do we balance that equation?
And how do we measure the impact of our business activity on the environment around us is another really important thing too.
Yeah, and that's actually what really draws me to this idea of working less. It's actually asking the question, well, what do we really need? I read a great book called The Soul of Money, which I highly recommend, and it starts to point to this question, but does it over, the course of a book. And basically it says, at some stage you have to sort of set the limits of what is enough, and that's not only your personal limits, but the limits within our planetary boundaries. And so, I think if we can live with less, we can work less.
So you'd support the idea of a 4-day week, I imagine.
Well, I would say I'm working towards the 4-day week, and I'm pretty close, actually. I'm very, very close.
So what are you able to let go so that you can condense into 4 days?
Well, let's see. I think it's actually more being, and maybe you are right with your first question, it's more being extremely efficient with the time that you use. I don't have a 9-to-5 job, and I work for myself and do development, so it's more being very critical with priorities and just knowing what really needs to be done. And I'm also in the process of really simplifying my life, and so I'm going to have a smaller house and trying to figure out how to eat locally and more effectively in the way of costs, and trying to share cars, and all of these things reduce our overall life costs, and then we can live more simply and we don't have to work as much to make as much money.
Now, if you're an employee, 4 days sounds great. However, if you're an employer, you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, if we're going to achieve everything in 4 days instead of 5, why do I need to pay them for 5?
Well, there's actually some interesting statistics around that show that other day off proves to be that you have much healthier employees, and that basically means they have more time with their families, more time to get exercise, more time to recover, so that when they are at work, they're doing much better. If you look at, average work hours across the world, I think New Zealand is 40, the United States is 40, but places across Europe are usually between 30 and 35. And so this isn't a novel new idea. It's actually well in practice in many more social countries across the world.
Now, you just mentioned the United States. They're not really big on holidays. They just work, don't they?
That's right. It is the extreme version of productivity and extreme version of work. I think there they have a maximum of 2 weeks of holiday and, very, very limited sick leave.
No, well, no wonder things like Thanksgiving are such a big deal because, they really do have that time off.
That's right. Yeah, Thanksgiving and Christmas, and I think there's a couple of other holidays that are, 4 and 5 days, but that's it in the U.S.
You kind of touched on this, but what have you done in your own life to work less?
Well, actually, what really inspired me is there was it's kind of a strange starting point, really. It's called ECOS, EKOS, and it was a calculator to calculate your impact on climate impact over the last year. And I thought it was such a great idea. And I was thinking, okay, well, instead of having such an impact on the climate every year and then paying that off by paying somebody else to plant trees, what would it look like if I could live at a zero carbon impact or even a negative carbon impact? And so I started to look at my life and going, well, what are those necessary steps? And one of them is to work less and produce less. And so that was a big motivation. So right now, basically, I'm about to get my house ready for sale and sell my house and downsize. And I'm really looking at ways that over the next, I said, in the first 45 years of my life, I want to know how much impact I've had. In the next 45 years, I want to bring that down to zero so I can die at a net zero carbon impact if it's possible. And a lot of it comes down to how I live and what I work on.
I think in people's life cycle, we all kind of downsize in a way because, you know, if you get, for instance, you might be married or not married and you've got children. Once the children have gone, it really doesn't make sense to be living in a 3 or 4 bedroomed house anymore.
That's right.
People will tend to downsize. Obviously, you've come up with this concept of the co-living idea, which is taking it even further. How do you think we're doing towards the, you know, I must say, I came to New Zealand to escape the idea of living in tiny houses. I mean, over in Britain, the average room sizes for people who are, say, of a working class ilk, you couldn't swing a cat in them, and it's quite depressing. It's really oppressive, the small room sizes. But how do you think we're doing with the tiny house movement in Christchurch, for instance?
Well, I'm not a fan of the tiny house movement. I see the tiny house movement as a reactive approach to housing, and I don't think 10 square meters is an appropriate or even healthy way to live. And really the 10 square meter house is essentially there, which is the definition of the tiny house, because it doesn't require a consent to build. And so that's why a lot of people are trying to do that, because then they can get around a consenting issue. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're providing themselves with quality housing. 10 square meters is a reactionary solution. I do think small houses are the way to go for the future. I don't think, if you look at our last, let's say, generation of housing, even here in New Zealand, it's quite extreme. The last I looked at the statistics was around 2013. It was 79% of Christchurch is a suburban home. And each year, those are becoming larger in size. And ultimately, when you study how people use space in a large suburban home, they're using somewhere between a third and 50% of it. And so you're actually building a whole lot that you're not using. And you're tending to build them further and further from the center of the city, where people tend to need to get to quite regularly. So you're car dependent, and you're building what you don't need. So it's resource intensive. And so I think there's some other solutions which banks need to start to get on board with, that offer people alternatives to that model.
I think part of the solution with regard to working less, or rather not spending 4 days at the office, is actually working from home, because there's so much desk work that could effectively be done from home now. Are you noticing, I mean, you must have colleagues who work in offices and things, large companies. Are you noticing there's more of a trend towards allowing home work?
Well, there's actually a name for this, and I just read it in an article a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember it exactly, but what's happening is people have essentially flexible work, and I think there's a term that goes into contracts for it these days, where you need to be in the office for a certain amount of hours during the week and at certain times, but otherwise you're on your own and you can come and go as you need, and you know that means you can pick up kids and work in the evenings or work in the mornings, whatever suits you. And that works for a lot of people. That's how OHO is run. Everybody in our team works that way, and same with Exchange, which are my companies. And I think that's a really, it's a very empowering way to work. That means you get your work done in on your terms and your time. And that really, I think, is very, very successful for us. Now, of course, certain jobs like hospitality, you can't do that.
Okay, well, we'd like to invite you back onto the show again next week, Carmia, if you'd like to come on and talk about another idea of yours or something that you've been thinking about, more food for thought here on After Dark. And I'd just like to wish you a good evening at this point.
Okay, well, have a lovely evening. We'll talk soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.